happened. I've always found comfort behind the wheel. There's something about the steady hum of the road and the way the landscape slowly unfolds that helps me think. That morning, the sky was pale blue, the kind that promises warmth later but still holds on to a cool breeze. I was planning a long drive, no destination in mind, just space to breathe. At my age, somewhere between raising kids, caring for aging parents, and keeping life stitched together, those moments are rare. I was backing out of the driveway when I saw him standing there, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, looking unsure. My brother's son. He had grown taller than I remembered, his face carrying a seriousness that didn't quite match his years. I rolled down the window and asked where he was headed. He shrugged and said nowhere in particular. There was a pause, then I heard myself say, "Get in, if you want. I'm just driving." He hesitated, then opened the door and settled into the passenger seat. The car smelled faintly of coffee and the pine-scented air freshener I'd hung months ago. As we pulled onto the road, we exchanged the usual small talk. "How's work? How's your dad? How's everything going?" His answers were polite but brief, like he was choosing each word carefully. Miles passed. The town faded into open stretches of road bordered by fields just beginning to turn green. The radio played softly, an old song I recognized but couldn't name. I noticed him looking out the window, jaw tight, eyes following the lines on the road. There was a weight about him that hadn't been there when he was younger, when his laughter came easy and loud at family gatherings. Finally, he spoke. He said he hadn't planned to go anywhere that day, but when he saw me, something told him to ask. He said he felt stuck, like life had handed him a script he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. I kept my eyes on the road, listening, giving him space. Sometimes that's the best way to show respect. He told me about expectations, about trying to live up to a name, a family history, a future that others seemed to have mapped out for him. He talked about fear, not in dramatic terms, but in the quiet way that fear really shows up, in sleepless nights and second-guessing every decision. I felt a lump form in my throat, not because his struggles were unfamiliar, but because I recognized them so clearly. I shared a little too. I told him about choices I'd made, roads I hadn't taken, and how, even now, I sometimes wonder who I might have been if I'd listened more closely to my own voice. The car became a small, moving room where honesty felt safe. There was no judgment, no advice being forced, just two people sharing a stretch of road and a moment of understanding. When he finished speaking, he let out a long breath, like he'd been holding it for years. He smiled, just slightly, and said he hadn't realized how much he needed to say those things out loud. I reached over and patted his arm, a simple gesture, one that said more than words could. As the sun climbed higher and the road curved ahead of us, I realized this drive wasn't just about getting away. It was about connection, about listening, and about remembering that sometimes the most surprising journeys happen when someone decides to sit beside you and tell their truth. The road carried us farther than I'd planned, and before long the familiar signs for the old Riverside diner came into view. I slowed down without really thinking about it. That place had been there forever, a low brick building with wide windows and a parking lot full of memories. I asked if he was hungry. He nodded, almost relieved, as if a pause would help him gather his thoughts. Inside, the air smelled like fresh coffee and grilled onions. A bell chimed when we opened the door, and a woman behind the counter smiled like she'd seen us 100 times before. We slid into a booth near the window. Sunlight streamed across the table, catching the swirl of steam rising from our mugs. It felt grounding, ordinary in the best way. For a few minutes, we talked about small things. The weather, the drive, how busy the place used to get on Sundays, but I could tell his mind was still turning. He stared into his cup, tracing the rim with one finger. Eventually, he looked up and said he'd never really talked to anyone in the family like this before. He explained that growing up, He'd learned to keep things light, to be the agreeable one. He didn't want to add worry to his parents' lives or seem ungrateful. But carrying all that silence had taken a toll. He spoke about work that felt empty, friendships that never quite went deep, and the quiet pressure of feeling like time was slipping away faster than he expected. I listened, remembering my own younger years, how I'd believed adults had it all figured out. I told him the truth as gently as I could, that many of us are still learning, even decades later. That doubt doesn't disappear with age, it just changes shape. His shoulders relaxed a little when I said that, like the idea gave him permission to be human. After we ate, we walked back to the car slowly. The river glinted in the distance, calm and steady. As we drove again, the conversation shifted. He asked about my life, not just the highlights, but the in-between parts. I told him about moments when I'd chosen stability over risk, and others when I'd surprised myself by being brave. I admitted there were times I wished someone older had told me it was okay to question the path I was on. He nodded, taking it in. He said hearing that made him feel less alone, less like he was failing some invisible test. That meant more to me than I expected. It reminded me that sharing our stories isn't about having answers, but about offering understanding. The afternoon light softened as we drove, shadows stretching across the road. There was an ease between us now, a quiet trust. I realized that this unexpected drive had opened a door for both of us. Not to solutions or neat conclusions, but to honesty. As we turned back toward town, I felt a sense of calm settle in. Whatever came next for him, and for me, this moment mattered. It was proof that connection can happen when you least expect it, and that sometimes just being willing to listen can change the direction of a journey. The closer we got to town, the quieter the world seemed. Traffic thinned, and the sky took on that late afternoon glow that makes everything look gentler than it really is. I took a side road I hadn't driven in years, one that climbed slowly toward an overlook above the valley. I didn't announce it, I just turned the wheel. He noticed but didn't question it. We parked at the top, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. Below us, the land stretched out in layers of green and gold, rooftops peeking through trees, the river threading its way like a silver ribbon. It was the kind of place you come to when you need perspective, when problems feel too close, and you need to step back. We sat there for a while without speaking. The wind brushed against the car, and somewhere nearby, I could hear birds calling to one another. Finally, he said that being there made him realize how small his worries looked from a distance, even though they felt heavy up close. I smiled because I'd had that same thought many times in my life. He told me he'd been considering a change. Nothing dramatic, just a different direction. A job opportunity in another state, a chance to start fresh without the weight of familiar expectations. Saying it out loud seemed to make it more real, and also more frightening. He asked what I thought. I chose my words carefully. I told him that no one else could decide for him, but that listening to his own sense of right and wrong mattered more than pleasing everyone around him. I reminded him that change doesn't erase who you are. It reveals it. He took that in quietly, nodding as if he were fitting the idea into place. Then he surprised me by asking if I'd ever regretted staying close to home. The question hung in the air. I answered honestly. I said there were moments of wondering, yes, but also moments of deep gratitude. Life, I'd learned, is rarely about one perfect choice. It's about making peace with the choices you make. He seemed relieved by that. He said he'd been afraid that choosing differently would mean letting people down. I told him that mutual respect goes both ways, and that those who care about him would eventually understand, even if it took time. As the sun dipped lower, my phone buzzed with a message from my brother, asking if we were okay. I showed it to his son, and he laughed softly. He said he should probably check in too. Before he did, he thanked me. Not in a grand way, just a simple, sincere thank you for listening and for treating him like his own person. On the drive back down, the headlights came on, illuminating the road ahead. I felt a quiet pride, not just in him, but in the moment we'd shared. It reminded me that even at this stage of life, there are still opportunities to learn, to connect, and to offer something meaningful to someone else. When the first streetlights of town appeared, I knew this day would stay with me. Not because it solved anything outright, but because it affirmed something I'd come to believe, that growth often happens in conversations we don't plan, with people we think we already know, on roads we've driven many times before. By the time we reached my brother's house, the evening had settled in fully. Porch lights glowed softly along the street, and the sounds of televisions and distant conversations drifted through open windows. I parked at the curb and turned off the engine, and for a moment neither of us moved. There was no awkwardness in the silence now, only a sense that something important had already been said. He gathered his things and paused before opening the door. He said this drive had given him clarity, not because everything suddenly made sense, but because he felt steadier inside. He said he'd been carrying his thoughts like a heavy bag, and setting them down, even briefly, had changed how they felt. I told him I was glad he trusted me with them. Before he stepped out, he said he hoped we could talk like this again sometime. I told him my door and my passenger seat were always open. He smiled, the kind of smile that reaches the eyes, and then he was gone, walking up the path toward the house where he'd grown up. I sat there a while longer, watching the light flick on in the hallway as he went inside. I thought about my brother, about family lines, and how stories pass between generations, sometimes quietly, sometimes in unexpected moments like this. I realized that being older doesn't mean you stop being needed in new ways. Sometimes it simply means you're better prepared to listen. The drive home felt different. The roads were familiar, but my thoughts were lighter. I considered how easy it would have been to say I was busy that morning, to drive off alone. Instead, I'd gained a reminder of something I'd nearly forgotten, that connection doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just shows up, waiting for you to say yes. In the days that followed, we exchanged a few messages. Nothing heavy, just check-ins. He told me he was going to explore that job opportunity, to at least see where it might lead. I encouraged him, not with pressure, but with trust. Whatever he decided, I knew he'd approach it more honestly now. As for me, I found myself paying closer attention to the people around me. I asked better questions. I listened longer. I understood, more deeply than before, that everyone is carrying a story, and that offering respect and patience can make all the difference. Looking back, that unexpected drive stands out as a turning point, not because it changed our lives overnight, but because it reminded me of the power of simple moments. A shared road, an open conversation, and the willingness to see each other clearly. At this stage of life, those are the things that matter most, and I'm grateful I recognized it when it happened.